the badge, and the black soldier. It was a sweltering afternoon in the outskirts of Fayetteville, North Carolina, and the sun burned with an intensity that seemed to warp the air around it. Sergeant Malik Jackson had just finished a long shift at the nearby Army base, the kind of day that made you wonder why you ever signed up for military service. His boots clacked against the pavement as he walked toward his car, the weight of the gear he was carrying pressing down on his shoulders. His uniform, a reminder of the duty he carried to his country, was starting to feel suffocating in the heat. Sergeant Jackson wasn't just any soldier. He had risen through the ranks, a symbol of perseverance, skill, and leadership. He had joined the Army when he was 18, driven by a sense of patriotism that had been passed down through generations in his family. His father had served in Vietnam, his grandfather in World War II. Now, it was his turn to wear the uniform with pride, despite the challenges that came with being a black man in a military where diversity was often more talked about than practiced. He climbed into his car and started the engine, the hum of the motor, a small comfort against the oppressive silence of the empty road. He had just planned to head home, get some rest, and prep for the next day's duties. What he didn't anticipate was the flashing blue and red lights that appeared in his rearview mirror just as he was about to turn onto the highway grate. "Just what I need," he muttered to himself as he signaled and pulled over to the side of the road. The squad car came to a stop behind him, the engine still running. Sergeant Jackson sat in his car, his hands gripping the steering wheel, unsure of why he was being pulled over. The road was practically deserted and he hadn't been speeding. He wasn't even in a rush. Moments later, a figure stepped out of the patrol car and walked toward him. Jackson glanced at the rearview mirror. The officer was tall, his uniform crisp, his face stern evening. "Sergeant," the officer said, his voice low but firm. Sergeant Jackson nodded in acknowledgement. "Evening, officer." "Can I help you with something?" The officer's eyes narrowed slightly, studying Jackson. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" "No, sir." "I wasn't speeding or anything." The officer hesitated for a moment, his eyes scanning the interior of the car, before returning to Jackson. "License and registration." Jackson reached into the glove compartment and handed over his documents, making sure to move slowly and deliberately. He didn't want to give the officer any reason to escalate the situation. He had seen enough of these kinds of encounters, especially as a black man in the South, where his military service didn't always guarantee respect. The officer took the papers and walked back to his patrol car without saying a word. Jackson sat back in his seat, exhaling sharply. He knew the drill. Nothing unusual had happened yet, but the officer's attitude was making him uneasy. About 5 minutes later, the officer returned to the car. But this time, something was different. The officer didn't hand back his documents immediately. Instead, he stood there for a moment, staring at Jackson, as if contemplating something. "You're a soldier, huh?" the officer said, his voice carrying an edge. Now Jackson's brow furrowed. "Yes, sir. I'm stationed at Fort Bragg. Sergeant Malik Jackson." The officer's gaze flickered to the ID in his hand, and then back to Jackson. "You don't look like a soldier. You don't look like you belong here." Jackson's stomach churned. He had heard those words before, but hearing them from a law enforcement officer stung differently. He didn't respond immediately, letting the officer's words hang in the air. "Where are you really from?" the officer asked, his tone now dripping with suspicion. "I'm from Atlanta," Jackson replied, his voice steady. "I'm stationed here, and I'm just heading home." The officer's lips curled into a tight smile. "Well, that's funny. I would have never guessed. Someone like you, a soldier in the Army? Should be careful out here, especially with all that's going on." The thinly veiled threat in his words was all too familiar, but Jackson kept his composure. He had learned to keep his cool in situations like this, even when everything in him screamed to lash out, to call out the blatant racism in front of him. What do you mean? Jackson asked, his voice colder now. The officer didn't answer right away. Instead, he stepped back a few paces, glancing around as if considering something. Then, without warning, he said, "I think I'll need to check your car." Before Jackson could respond, the officer opened the passenger door and started to peer inside. His movements were deliberate, but there was an undeniable aggression behind them, as though he were looking for anything to make this encounter escalate. Jackson's muscles tensed. He had nothing to hide, but he wasn't about to let the officer push him around either. "Officer, I've given you my ID and my papers." "I don't see any reason for a search," Jackson said, his voice firm. Trying to assert control over the situation, the officer paused, looking at Jackson with a mixture of disdain and amusement. "What? You think I'm just gonna let you go because you wear a fancy uniform? It doesn't matter what you do, boy. You'll never be one of them." Jackson's heart sank. He knew exactly where this was going. Before the officer could react further, Jackson saw his opening. He had already reached for his phone earlier, keeping it in his pocket in case something went wrong. With lightning speed, he hit the recording button and discreetly placed the phone on the seat next to him. The officer had no idea. "Listen, I've had enough of this," Jackson said, his voice low but cutting through the tension like a blade. He wasn't going to let this go any further. He wasn't going to stand there and take it. The officer's hand went to his belt, and for a moment, Jackson thought he was going to reach for his weapon. That was all it took for Jackson to make a split-second decision. Without warning, he threw his car into gear, flooring the gas pedal. The tires screeched against the asphalt as the car shot forward, leaving the officer in a cloud of dust. Jackson's heart raced. He could hear the officer shouting behind him, but he wasn't going to stop. He couldn't. The officer quickly jumped back into his patrol car and gave chase, his siren blaring, but Jackson was already ahead of him. His military training kicked in as he weaved through the streets, taking corners sharply, driving with precision. For the next few minutes, it was a blur of adrenaline and terror. Jackson's mind was focused only on getting away from the officer, not because he had anything to hide, but because he knew that if he didn't, this would escalate beyond anything he could control. A black soldier running from a white officer. The media would eat it up. He'd be painted as the criminal, and no one would care about the racism that had triggered this moment. Eventually, Jackson pulled into an alleyway, the patrol car hot on his heels. He slammed on the brakes, skidding into a narrow space between two buildings. For a split second, everything went silent. He heard the officer's car screech to a halt, the sound of footsteps approaching. Jackson, still breathing heavily, crouched behind a dumpster, his hand clutched around his phone. He waited. He didn't know how long he'd have to stay hidden, but he wasn't going to let this officer get away with it. The sound of footsteps grew louder, and then nothing. Jackson peered around the corner and saw the officer walking back to his patrol car, a look of frustration on his face. The moment he was out of sight, Jackson breathed a sigh of relief. He quickly started his car again and drove off, not looking back. But as he drove away, he knew something had shifted inside him. He had just run. He had just been chased for nothing more than the color of his skin. He wasn't sure what would happen next, but one thing was certain: he wasn't going to let this go. Not this time. The fight wasn't over.